Last week we finished by putting the boards on the book, and this week it's time to cover the book and finish the full buckram library style binding. Before we do apply the covering material, there are a few jobs that need to be done, and they'll require us opening the book. So in preparation for that, we'll open the text block like it was a brand new book. Because the tube on the spine is only 2 layers of craft paper at this point, it's a bit weak, so I finished that opening in a vertical position. Now the first thing we'll do is the back corners, and I'll do these typical back corners that are a bit longer in the vertical direction than the horizontal. There's very little documentation on this style of binding. I'm not even sure how common it was. I've never seen one in the wild. So I'm just going to use a back cornering style that I think will work well with buckram. The next thing to do is to slit open the top of the spine tube so that we can do the turn-ins of the covering material. Simply open the book to access the hollow spine, and using a very sharp knife slip down about 1 inch, which is enough to do the turn-in. At this point the boards have really sharp edges and the corners are really sharp, and this is a library binding. It's meant to see a lot of use, and those sharp edges and corners would dent really easily. So it's just better to take the sharp edges off the boards and round the 4-edge corners just a bit, not too much. And that will help with the library or universal corners that we'll do later as well. In the small book by Nikki and Karen, I know that Nikki was particularly pleased with the fact that they documented this next step quite well, and in Johnson it's glossed over and not well explained. But when we turn in the cover material, you want the back of the tube to extend up to the height of the boards to provide support to the buckram, but you need to remove the front so that you can't see it. It'll be exposed, so you need to trim that off. Now, in the purple book, they just use a scalpel to do that. I just find it a little bit dangerous to do it from the start. It's good for trimming up, but I was worried I was going to puncture the back of the tube, so I started with the small scissors and then just cleaned it up with the scalpel. If you haven't already bought a copy of the book, I highly recommend you do. I'm sure it was not a large print run, and once it's out of print it'll be pretty hard to get, and it is a very good book. Finally, it's time to cover the book, and I happen to have a piece of buckram about the right size. It's Arborlay buckram. I've marked a margin 20mm in so that it's easy to position once I've applied the adhesive to the material. I've also marked the joint positions, and I'll start by gluing out to that position. I'll put some adhesive into the joint groove, which will help with adhesion in that area, but don't put the adhesive up where the tab has been removed. So I put the adhesive, I work that into the buckram, and I start there. Now I'm using mix because it is a bit tricky to work this material down into the joint, and I just want to use mix to give myself a bit of leeway or protection if I don't get something doesn't go quite right. I'm using the 4mm knitting needles to hold the material in the joints. Again, I'm putting some adhesive in the joint just to make sure that the buckram stays down in that joint, which is really important. I'm using the stippling motion to work the adhesive into the grain of the buckram. And I put some adhesive on the spine of the book because you really don't like the material popping off the spine. Before I lay it down, I'll work it into the joint and then I'll lay it down onto the board. Now, for everyone that really enjoyed my making a mistake in the full leather binding and having to recover from that, I've just made a bit of a boo-boo on this binding, and so you've got a treat coming up soon. I'll give it a nip in the press. Now, this isn't a press it overnight type job. I think I left it in there maybe 5 minutes just to make sure that the material is well adhered to the spine and down into the joint groove. Don't overpress it because that may cause the material to pop off the spine. Now trim up the turn-ins. Now I cut the buckram to exactly the right height, but because it's hard to estimate or calculate how long you'll need the material, I made it longer, so I really only had to do the one turn-in or trim the one turn-in. Now these universal corners, or often called library corners, are a bit different. It doesn't matter which turn-in you do first. You don't have to do the head then the foredge, because the material from the two don't overlap. But you don't trim the corner, you just fold it across at 45 degrees. It is a bit tricky to get them to sit down, and that slightly rounded corner helps in turning them over. Now I'm going to turn in the foredge just so that's done and it's out of the way. For turning in the corners and the foredge, it's easier to use a straight PVA, which keys faster and just holds everything in place. Now, these library style bindings don't have decorative headbands. Instead, they rely on the head cap to provide some protection at the tail and head of the spine. Now, in the leather binding, after the leather had been applied, a piece of cord was inserted and the turn-in was turned over that piece of cord, which provided a little bit of extra bulk to form the head cap. Now, the buckram has even less bulk than the leather, so that piece of cord is really handy for forming a nice solid head cap. However, turning in buckram, especially into the hollow spine, is quite tricky. It's trickier than turning in the leather. And it would have been a really good idea if I'd adhered that piece of cord to that little piece of craft paper that extends up past the text block at the spine. And Karen and Nikki actually emphasised that in their book, but I didn't actually read it quite carefully enough or didn't pay enough attention, and I forgot about that until I went to do the turn-ins. So I have to go back and get this piece of cord cut to the right size and now stuck to that little piece of craft paper, and now I've got the turn-ins in the way. It would have been much easier to do without the covering material in the way. But that's where micro spatulas come in really handy, and it's just a learning experience for me and everyone else. I'm using 2 and a bit millimeter cotton cord that's quite solid. It's actually the thickest sort of nice cord that I have, and I wanted something solid for these head caps. Now the squares are 3 millimeters, so with the thickness of the buckram, that's about the right size. If you had smaller squares, then you might want to use a smaller diameter cord for this head cap. Now I'm going to put a bit of adhesive on them and try and not get the adhesive on the edge of the text block, and then I'm just going to let them dry in place. It's going to be much easier to do the turn ends if that cord isn't going to go free. Now before we proceed with the turn-ins, something to check is to make sure that the slits at the top of the hollow are open. They'll probably have closed up with a bit of adhesive, so you just need to tease them open with something that's thin but not razor sharp. You don't want to cut anything, you just want to open these slits back up, and the micro spatula is perfect for that. If you don't already own a micro spatula or four, then these I think are almost essential bookbinding tools. They're just so handy for a million little things. Now I find turning in buckram into a hollow spine harder than doing leather. Maybe it's just because I don't do it near as often, but I'm just going to do a practice run. It's just the buckram doesn't have the stretch and flexibility. Now if it was leather, we'd be using paste so that there's plenty of time to work, but I'm going to use PVA for the turn-ins out towards the corners, and then I'm going to use mix at the spine. So the mix will give me a bit of open time, but it will also key quite well for the buckram. So I'll apply the mix first at the top of the spine and a little bit either side, and then I'll do the PVA on the rest of the turn-ins. So push the boards down a bit to open up the joint area to make it a little bit easier to turn in the buckram. Once you get it in place, get the rest of the turn-in down. With the mix, there's a bit of time to come back and refine the turn-in at the top of the spine. So using thinner bone folders or your micro spatula, work the material down the inside of the hollow, work out any creases and get it nice and smooth, and form the material over the piece of cord at the head cap. It's much nicer and easier to work with leather at this stage. However, this style of binding with split board attachment was used commonly in the library binding business, and I guess towards the end of the period it was used, it transitioned away from leather to heavy book cloths or buckram. Now I have emphasized this library binding name, however it probably is best to call it a split board attachment binding or something like that, because the name library sort of implies that it can only be used in library bindings, and obviously modern libraries don't use this binding style anymore. And it's interesting, there's a number of people doing courses on split board bindings. Michael Burke does a course where he does a half leather binding in a split board attachment with a hollow spine. So it's a combination of the first video series I did on this library style and this one. So it's a hollow spine but with leather, making it much easier to do the turn-ins at this stage. I've done a workshop with Michael. He's an excellent instructor, and if you ever have the opportunity, you should jump at doing a course or a workshop with him. We'll finish by tidying up the head caps, which is easier to do if you tie up the spine with some cord. Now the buckram doesn't really like thin cord, so I've used quite a thick cord, what I normally use in the springback bindings, and I'm just stretching out the head caps to the side. You can't really form them. The buckram doesn't mould like wet leather does. Now you don't want the spine to be higher than the boards because the spine will drag on the shelf. So if you put the book on a flat surface and just tilt it up slightly and force the head caps down a little bit, that will stop that occurring. Now we'll paste down the end papers. Now this, my end papers are quite thick. They're not going to stretch, so I didn't trim them, and because they are quite thick they'll go down easily, so I'm just using straight PVA. If you're using thin end papers, then maybe use mix. So I'll put tins in the front and back. If you don't have tins, then the plastic sheets will be fine. And I'm going to give it one of those firm 10-second nips that just smooths everything out nicely. It's interesting to compare the two styles of library binding, the tight back and the hollow back, and clearly the book with the hollow spine throws up much better and lays open much flatter. You can see towards the front and back of the book, the tight back binding just doesn't want to sit open. That's the full buckram library style binding done. I hope you've enjoyed this video series. I've really enjoyed making this book. As always, I really enjoy your comments and your feedback and appreciate you hitting the big thumbs up button. If you want to be notified of my future videos, please hit the subscribe button. I hope everyone's staying safe, and until next time, cheerio.